The ABC this week has rejected a complaint of bias from the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council about a Q&A episode in May concerning the recent conflict between Israeli forces and Hamas insurgents. In case you missed it, here are a few of the excerpts from that episode.
Israel is targeting civilians. Yes, it is targeting civilians. When you say Israel has a right to self-defence, what you're actually asking us to embrace as a proposition is that an occupier and a coloniser, a state that is based on a racial apartheid system...
I don't accept any of those.
It is not correct to say that Israel is right and is using the appropriate use of force in response to what Hamas has been doing. This is an unlawfully occupied people who have suffered great disadvantage, discrimination and human rights violations.
Because at the end of the day, in Palestine, young people are dying, I'm sure in Israel too, but it comes back to the occupier, and if it's really geared, is it colonisation and we're trying to wipe out a culture here, that's not okay.
I do not condone rockets being fired into Israelis, but at the same time, the response that we saw, I have to say, was disproportionate.
4 of the 5 panelists condemned Israel for its retaliation against Hamas for firing hundreds of rockets into Israeli territory. They were author and Palestinian activist Randa Abdel Fattah, international human rights lawyer Jennifer Robertson, who has represented the Palestinians at the International Criminal Court, Indigenous songwriter Mitch Tambo, and federal Labor MP and Muslim Ed Huzik. Only one panelist, Coalition MP Dave Sharma, spoke in Israel's favour, and even then he struggled to get a word in.
Yeah, the proximate cause was that Hamas started to fire rockets at Israeli civilian populations. And that's
a lie.
1 against 4. And as the Australia, Israeli and Jewish Affairs Council Executive Director Colin Rubenstein pointed out, the sole panellist defending Israel was an Australian of Indian heritage. The ABC allowed a pro-Palestinian mainstream voice on the panel, but did not extend the same opportunity to a pro-Israeli group. In dismissing the complaint, the ABC claimed no view was, quote, unduly favoured over any other. It also claimed it invited Israeli representatives on as members of the audience, that is, not as panellists. During the programme's screening, ABC radio presenter Patricia Karvelis tweeted Ed Huzik speaking passionately about Palestinian victims. Former ABC Four Corners journalist Sophie McNeil tweeted, "It's about time Human Rights Watch's historical finding that hashtag Israel is committing the crime of a hashtag apartheid was mentioned on the ABC." Put simply, this is activism, not journalism. And as The Australian reported that same month, dozens of Australian journalists, including ones from the ABC, The Guardian Australia, The Age, The Sydney Morning Herald, The Saturday Paper, Crikey and SBS, have signed a petition demanding publishers push the Palestinian cause. Some of their demands have in fact already been implemented at the ABC, if QandA serve as an example. They are: consciously and deliberately make space for Palestinian perspectives, prioritising the voice of those most affected by the violence, avoid the both-siderism that equates the victims of a military occupation with its instigators, reject frameworks that rely on passive formulations and weasel words, clashes, etc., to obscure the reality of a violence disproportionately endured by Palestinians. Among the signatories were ABC presenters Jonathan Green, Benjamin Law, and former ABC Washington correspondent Zoe Daniel. So much for ABC editorial policies, which require that the national broadcaster gather and present news and information with due impartiality, and not unduly favour one perspective over another. But according to the ABC, there's no issue for bias. And a reminder that only last month, ABC Chair Ita Buttrose rejected calls for an independent ombudsman to investigate complaints against the national broadcaster. Nick, it's really interesting when you've got journalists that are using their pre-experiences to form a judgment about something that maybe hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, and this idea of both-siderism, you want to avoid both-siderism. I suppose they mean not reporting both sides of the argument. Well, the ABC has been doing that for years, particularly on this question of Israel and Palestine. They've had a completely one-eyed view. They're responsible for a lot of very, very inaccurate reporting on it. And I think that what makes it frustrating for me is that it's plain that most of the people that are stating opinions or reporting on this for the ABC haven't done their homework. They haven't done the hard yards, which you have to do as a journalist, of reading very deeply into the history of that part of the world and the history of Israel and everything that's happened since. And then you can start to make sense of it. But they just go in with this post-colonialist victimhood mentality and just lay that lens over all of it and just make a hash of it.
And Gemma, it appears to be quite the trendy thing to do, to be very pro-Palestine and to be out there on Twitter taking those talking points. But when it's journalists and journalists that are paid by the taxpayer, should we be expecting more?
Well, we should be expecting the bare minimum from anyone who calls themselves a working journalist and takes money to do that job, and that is to report every story without fear or favour. To give due fairness and accuracy to every story, to remove one's personal biases and personal prejudices around a story and report the facts. I mean, the absolute horror of the embarrassment, I would go so far, Jack, is to say you're a journalist, you're signing a petition to push a perspective on a story. That is not journalism.